I apologize to those of you who came last week and found out that I was teaching, so you came back this week. Dad came to me on Friday and said, "Hey, could you do Sunday?" And I said, "Sure." I have hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of teaching ready. Because somebody already wrote all the content for me. Which I'm going to get open. One of the things I like about being in this church is nobody, at least none of us who get up in front of a microphone, take any stock in the fact that we have a microphone. You know what I'm saying? Like in most churches, a microphone and good lighting and makeup and a stage means that you have credibility. Whether or not you've got like any kind of degree or lifetime of study or anything like that in the subject. And that seems to be something that kind of plagues the American public in general. You know, I mean, and it's we see it in politics all the time. Like an actor gets up to talk about politics and people are like, "Well, why are you talking? You're an actor." You know, and but it's because they feel like because they have the spotlight, they're qualified. And maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I mean, I don't know what their professional degrees are in, and that's fine. But it's just we feel like when the lights are on us, we're qualified to say things. And I'm saying we, okay? I'm not saying they. It happens to all of us. It's the sickness of the stage in the American church. Okay, we increase ourselves in our own minds because we're 6 inches higher than everyone else. You know, only with me, this just puts me eye level with most of you, so. But it's kind of a disease, and it's kind of disgusting, and I'm kind of thrilled that we're getting rid of our stage. Yeah. I mean, I know some people are a little uncomfortable with it, and I started about 3 years ago just looking. Some of you were here, most of you were here when I started teaching this series on like what Christianity is, and that's actually when I resigned. Because I realized that what Christianity actually is and what we do on Sundays never meet. And so, you know, this is a fun thing, and I love doing what we're doing here, but this is not what it means to be a Christian. This is a study group that meets at a building. And that's great, and I'm getting my degrees so that I can help teach this better. But this isn't Christianity. Okay? And so what it's become versus what it used to be, and everybody does this, we long for the make Christianity great again. There is nothing wrong with what I just said. In the first 100 years of the church, Christianity was empire subversive, and empire hated it, and they beheaded Christians. And Nero stuck Christians on pikes and lit them on fire for his parties because he was so terrified about what they were doing to his empire. Okay, so nowhere in that did they swear any kind of allegiance to Mr. Empire or to his opponent or to the flag. Okay, they were being murdered because they were so effective at undoing what empire was doing. Okay, and Jesus said, "Heal all who are oppressed." And we charismatics go around and we lay hands on people and we say, "We're doing what Jesus said." And this has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about today. But the problem is they were healing the oppressed by actually like giving them homes and giving them food. These people were oppressed by empire, and so they were being healed, okay, and physical healing. But that wasn't the only thing that was going on. Okay, and we get caught up in this, we need to get back to the miracle days. No, we need to get back to like it's a miracle that an American would think about someone else. Amen. So we need to get back to thinking about others. I mean, it's really not that hard of a formula. It's care for everyone else. You know, and Jesus says, love your neighbors. And they're like, well, I don't like that one. He's like, fine, love your enemies. And he doesn't really give you any other option. Like, well, what about, there's no third category. I mean, it's, in the ancient world, you're either a neighbor because you live by them, or you're an enemy because you're trying to kill them. And Jesus is like, love them all. And people are like, well, but he didn't really mean that. And so that's why I went into what I went into, because of all the he didn't really mean statements. And I found out that there's a whole lot of stuff that we're taught that doesn't really mean anything close to what they said it meant. Right. And so I found that the worst of that came in the Hebrew Bible. Look at that brilliant segue into my teaching today. Awesome. And this is the reason I started with the fact that none of us who get up here and have a microphone feel like we have any credibility because of it is because, Nathan made a statement today that says he has a Pharisaic friend. Okay? That's a common statement like in the grace movement. We think that way. We think, oh yeah. Well, what we've got to understand, A, is Jesus was a Pharisee. If that shocks any of you, I'm sorry. And B, that the large, and this isn't Nathan at all, this is a lingo issue, the large disconnect in the church between Christianity and Judaism and is called anti-Semitism, right? And that comes because we have this idea that Jesus is something other than a Jew discussing Judaism with his Jewish schoolmates. Okay, Jesus isn't starting a new religion and he's trying to get these other people to believe in it. He's a Pharisee who thinks he has the right way to interpret the scriptures. And so actually all of us do too. We feel like he had the right way. And so what we're doing is we are Pharisees who follow after a Pharisee rabbi. The school itself is not a bad school. Pharisees were people who did what they thought was best to bring God back to the land. We think that's silly now, but guess what? They didn't. And pre-scientific worldview says, well, when things are going bad, God is gone. It's not just that it's a weather pattern. It's not just that our enemy salted our ground and now things aren't growing. They're different. It's all God. Yeah. But the way we can kind of look at this is, the Bible's pretty clear, right? The Pharisees believe there is a resurrection. What does Jesus continually talk about after his death? Resurrection. Okay? He holds a theology that is a part of the Pharisaic school. Okay? So even if he's not Pharisee of Pharisees, as Paul claims, he's at least trained in their school, and he's debating with his schoolmates. Okay? And this is the reason, at least arguments from silence usually don't make up much, but this is one of the reasons we probably don't see much debate between Jesus and the Zealots, or the Essenes, or the other sects that are around at the time. He's only kind of just going after his own, because he knows it well enough to do it. And like Wendy Francisco pointed out the other day, and I think it's something we all have to keep in mind, okay, is that someone who is outside of a system doesn't have the authority to speak to the system, right? And so that means that Jesus doesn't have the authority to speak toward sacrifice if he's not participating in the sacrificial system. So I know some of us have this idea that, oh, no, Jesus is something totally different. He's a pacifist who doesn't do anything wrong. He never participates in the sacrifices. He is just pure grace. And well, no, he's a human being who's born in the first century, and he can't be totally different from everyone else. Otherwise, he's not a human. Right? It's like he's not 2,000 years advanced beyond his contemporaries. He called the Canaanite woman a dog. And there's no that's not he wasn't, oh, let me just give you a pet name. He was, pet. He was doing what Jews did at the time. They called Canaanites and Samaritans, and they called them dogs. And so we don't need to feel like he's something different than us. And that's hard. And this is where the church fathers are very helpful. Fully human as we are human. Fully divine as God is divine, right? Those two exist together. But the fully human part, I think, gets ignored quite a bit. Now, where the church fathers are really unhelpful is in the fact that they're all very anti-Semitic. Lots of them wrote really horrendous things about the Jews and about how God will be pleased when we finally wipe them off the map, basically. And all of, when you're first getting into theology in a seminary, one of the things they talk to you about is that all theology needs to stand at the gates of Auschwitz. So your personal prosperity, God will bless me, rain down vacations upon me, get me out of any negative situation. All of that has to go stand before his chosen people being roasted in flames and say, can that work here? And if it can't work there, then you need to get a new theology. And it's not that God doesn't bless us, but it's that we have to not be historically myopic in how we're viewing things. I call it privileging the present, where we're only thinking about us in the here and now. And so when I pray this oh God, get me out of this traffic ticket, and then I don't get a ticket and I rejoice, what does that say to a 12-year-old sex slave who's been praying for 6 years to get out of that? Right. and God hasn't answered her. And then I stand up here on Sunday morning and broadcast my message to the world, and I talk about God getting me out of my traffic ticket. So this kind of stuff, if we don't check our fan fiction at the gates of suffering, then really, we're just being abusive. And because that really is what it's about. And we've said things here, Dad said things, and I've said things that they're bad things to have said from the pulpit. And it's because that's what you do when you're writing fan fiction. And fan fiction, I love it. I do. I really do. I watch movies that are fan fiction that are based on other books and other movies, and sometimes you don't know that because it's done so well that it's like it's its own thing, and then sometimes there are movies that are supposed to be based on it, and you're like, where is the connection here? But it's still fan fiction. It's still the same thing. And look, that applies with theology too. Sometimes I go into a church and I'm like, this is nothing like the book. And then sometimes I go into a church and I say, wow, this is really, really, really off. Like there's nothing in the story anymore. And a lot of that comes because we just don't like the story. We're uncomfortable. We have become uncomfortable with other people believing things that we're not sure about. And the biblical authors had their own beliefs. And so instead of allowing them their own world and their own context and their own beliefs, we've gone in and we've said, well, I don't like what the church, which has nothing to do with the Hebrew Bible, I don't like what the church has done with this particular concept or word or doctrine that seems to appear in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change all these words, or I'm going to throw it out completely, or I'm going to use some kind of philosophy to explain why God couldn't possibly be that way. And that's just not what's going on. And I've made the comparison before. This is like going and in your English lit class, going to Shakespeare and trying to write a historical exegesis of Shakespeare. Like, he's not writing history. So why would you do that? These people are not writing, they haven't seen God face to face and are being dictated to what God is like, and so they're writing it down, and so you better get it right. They're people who live in a context, who are writing to a context from stories that were created in another context. And we saw this last week, right? We saw this strange editorial, like, here's a story in the middle of nowhere that doesn't belong to the ends on either end of it. And we're going to see this again today. This happens again in this next chapter. So what are they doing? Well, I can tell you one thing they're not doing is they're not writing down for once and all time a complete summarization of what God is like. Okay? Jews call the Hebrew Bible salvation history. It's God's acts within their history. Okay? It's not God's character. It's not the nature of God. It's not even a theology. It's a salvation history. Okay? And so that, I think, kind of gets us closer to how we Christians in the 21st century should be viewing the New Testament. It's a salvation history. It's how we got saved. It's not how we get saved. It's how we were saved by Yahweh. Because Jesus is Yahweh. Okay? He's not some other dude. He's not the offspring. He's Yahweh. Son language is metaphorical. Okay. We're in Genesis 21. And we finished Genesis 20, and there's this whole thing about Abimelech having been dried up, or his family having been dried up by God, right? And it's the second time, but not really. It's the second time that Abraham has said that Sarah is his sister to some foreign king who wants to take her for his harem, is essentially what happened. And then the biblical author still calls him Abraham the prophet, even though he's just lied. And so something is going on here. There's this just kind of story that's stuck in, right? And I read from Klaus Westermann, who showed that this is a reimagining of a known story into a new kind of motif, a new time. Okay, and the original story of Sarah and Abraham in Egypt had some stuff in it that puts it about 1800, 1900 BCE. Okay, and then this next story is a few hundred years later in some of the things that they say. And so they're reimagining these stories into new contexts, and we'll do this again when we hit Genesis 26, but they do it again with Isaac and him. And I think I said Abraham last week, but that's because I make missteps when I'm just talking. You should never take my word for it. Go study. And they do it again with Isaac, though, right? They reimagine the same scenario where Isaac says, this is my sister, and then they presume all these things that you know about the stuff before it. Okay, and so what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to get us all, to read every word of the Bible. And so I'm pointing out little things that seemingly are insignificant. Because I think sometimes, how many of us have read through the Bible cover to cover? You know? And how many can say that you focused on every little, even preposition? No. And sometimes, actually most of the time in the biblical text, the prepositions are the most important thing. You know, and things like little particles, there's a particle that the word is called ze. And it means that is. And whenever a priest comes in and he says ze, that means he's writing later on. And so what they'll do is they'll say this place, which is this place. And so what they're saying is, hey, you don't know this name because this is a long time ago. And so let us explain to you what it is now. That'd be like Istanbul was Constantinople, right? Everybody knows that. So it'd be like the biblical writer saying, so Moses went up to Constantinople, that is Istanbul. And so you would know what it is, okay? So that only happens later, after the change of name has happened to the place, okay? So these are little things. They're little editorial notes. And they're little things that if we can kind of really intently read the text, all of a sudden we start seeing, oh wait, they're making some explanations here. They're telling us about what time in their history people started to call God Yahweh instead of El. You know, and we know of El from the Ugarit texts, and El was the head of the Canaanite pantheon of gods. Okay, so this name is known in the ancient world before the Bible. And today we're going to meet El Olam. Okay, and so we're going to find something about Hebrew grammar that's kind of cool. So anyways, let's go to Genesis 20:18, and we're going to read that last verse and then go right into 21. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Okay, so here we go. There's the explanation for how this story got stuck where it was. Because right after that you have, then the Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said. Okay, so what we've got here is we've got an insertion by a priest who had a story, or an editor or something, who had a story that he didn't know where to put it. And so he stuck it in between Lot and Sarah. Okay? So, but now we're going to talk about Sarah. The Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him, and Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now Sarah said, God has brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. And again, we've talked about this, I'm not going to break in too much yet, but the telescoping of time that happens in these stories, right? The child grew and was weaned. That's 4 or 5 words, you know, and this is maybe 3 to 4 years. Okay, so what happened in that time? What's Abraham been doing? What's Sarah been doing? You know, nothing apparently has happened. Nothing, after all of the events of Abraham's life that we've heard about, nothing eventful is happening right after he has the promise. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had bore to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac. The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. Which one? But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. That's wise, sage advice. Yes. Whatever your wife says, obey it. For it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. Now you're starting to get a little bit of the emotion in all this, right? Okay. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went, filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Okay, we're going to break there and just go back and look over that, because this is another break where Abraham goes and talks to Abimelech. So, again, we have this right away kind of abrupt insertion. Oh, and now we're switching, like its screen went dark and we're fading open to Sarah now. Okay, and when it says the Lord dealt with her, that word in Hebrew is pakad, and it's like the one that you learn your verb paradigms on, because there's this neat little song that goes with it, and it always follows it, and it's not weird. But this word, and this is from Nahum Sarna that we've been reading, he says the Hebrew stem PKD connotes the direct involvement or intervention of God in human affairs. This can be of a providential nature, or it can be judgmental or redemptive. The verb is a leitmotif of the divine promises of national redemption from Egyptian slavery. The birth of Isaac thus marks a new and momentous age in the unfolding plan of history. Okay, so this is the fact that they use the word pakad for God coming to visit Sarah is a direct involvement of God. Okay, it's not just from afar. Okay, it's not like, oh, he saw and said, yeah, okay, fine, she can have a kid now. No, somehow God was directly involved with Sarah's womb. Okay. So by the time we get to the New Testament, we should understand that God's direct involvement with the womb of a woman is not a new thing. Okay. And then let's read some stuff on Isaac's name. Everybody knows this stuff because everybody talks about it. Sarna again notes, he says, Isaac is the only patriarch who does not undergo a name change because God's the one who gave him the name. Right? So all the other patriarchs have a name change. Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah, Jacob to Israel. And it's always Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when they talk about the patriarchs, right? That's the fathers. Okay, so Isaac is why? Because Sarah laughed at God. And God said, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and name him now, instead of changing his name later. And so God named him. God named him Laughter. And what's cool is that the first child is Ishmael, okay? Ishmael. In Hebrew, that means he hears God. So God hears. That's what El hears. That's what it means. Why? Because multiple reasons. Because Abraham wanted an heir. And Hagar was provided to him and an heir came. So God heard. And so he named him God Hears. Okay? But also, here you have at the end of this little story, you have the child crying out in the wilderness, and what happens? God hears. Okay, so it's the everything about the kid God hears. And he gets plugged into this, and then he's kind of dissociated, right? And if you read the Quran here, the story is vastly different between what happens. And so Ishmael is actually given a blessing, and I don't know the whole story, so, but it's different. He's not thrown out, he's not disowned, he's actually a part of the covenant. Okay, and actually the Bible does say that he's pretty, he's still going to make a great nation. He's still one of your offspring. Right. Still going to make a great nation out of you. I'm still, you kind of rush through some things, but I'm still going to go ahead and keep my word. And Hagar's name in Hebrew means the stranger. It's not a real name. Like they demoted her so much as to just call her the stranger. Hagar means stranger. Remember I said last week, Abraham was a Gur dwelling in Gerar. A Gur is a alien, is a foreigner, is a stranger. Gar is another way to say it. The vowels are a little They kind of change around for different reasons. So she gets this name, the stranger, and has a kid, El hears. And then, but here we have thousands of year old text that says, but God went ahead and made him a great nation. And people want to argue about this. And it's like, well, I don't want to get into this political battle, but Palestine, Israel, come on. Like, you don't have biblical ground to stand on. But anyways. Okay, so let's read here, though. This is starting to, I thought this was good. He says, Hebrew Yitzhak is a verbal form meaning he laughs. It is almost certainly an abbreviation of an original fuller theophoric form, Yitzhak El. So El laughs. So what he's saying is that what the evidence points to is that what God named Sarah's child is, I'm laughing at you. Not Sarah laughed, but it's God laughing at Sarah's laughter. It's so. The full form is never found in the Bible, nor is any other proper name ever compounded with this stem. Nevertheless, all three biblical traditions relating to the birth of Isaac emphatically connect the name with human laughter. The explanation for all this is twofold. On the one hand, there is a deliberate dissociation from the pagan mythological origin of the laughter of, I'm going to try and, a capricious laughter. Let me just put it that way, because he goes like 3 sentences of garbage. On the other hand, the laughter of God in the Bible, by contrast, invariably expresses his reaction to the ludicrous attempts of men to act independently of his will and in defiance of it. The repeated laughter of humans in connection with the birth of Isaac is, in a sense, the inverse of God's laughter, for it is a questioning of divine sovereignty. The person of Isaac, therefore, represents the triumph of the power of God over the limitations of nature. So in essence, the power of God's will over the lie of personal free will. And then we'll go ahead and read a couple more little statements here that are really good, and then we'll get into the next part of the story. El was the name of the god who was head of the Canaanite pantheon. The Ugaritic texts stress his antiquity and eternity. And then we'll get into the title in a little bit. So we're about to get into a part of the story where Abraham is going to call God something different. Okay, and so we'll have to come back to this little quote in just a second. But I wanted to kind of frame it there. So El is the god of Canaan. And so when we see all throughout the Bible, we see El epithets of God, El Shaddai, El Elyon, El Olam, which we're about to see. And these are all God the, or God who is, or the God of. Okay? And like El Shaddai would be like not just God who is your provision, but like the God of fecundity. So it applies to personal reproduction as well as like land. Okay? And so these are names that are known from time before the biblical text. And so we've run into some of these, but this is the first one that we're going to run into that is actually like they've found the name elsewhere, like outside of Israel. And so what does that do? You know, is Yahweh, like the God of Israel, has he always been Yahweh? Is that even should we even be saying Yahweh, since what God said when Moses said, "Who are you?" He said, Eyeh, Asher, Eyeh. That means I am what I am. It doesn't mean my name is Yahweh. That means I am what I am. And, you know, it could even be like I am whatever I say I am. So when Moses goes and he says, they say, "Who sent you?" He says, "Yahweh." Well, that's not a name. That's the third person masculine singular verbal form of I am, which is he is. And so, you know, this isn't even really a name, and then later on it gets turned into a name, and so there's this development that happens in biblical theology, and some of it happens before the Bible, and some of it happens outside of the Bible. Okay, and so we're going to come across some of these names, and I think a good Bible, or at least if we're going to be reading the Bible with any kind of intent, what we should do is we should have a little Post-it note that we write, something like "the Lord" in all caps, and then hyphen Yahweh. And then we write God, and we write hyphen El. And then we write all these other names, Shaddai, Olam, and start saying, okay, these are actual, some of them are known deities from the ancient world. And so what is Israel? That's it. Israel's polytheistic. They worshiped other gods. That's all there was to it. We have record of them worshiping other gods, and they got destroyed for it. So does that mean that for all time, obviously Abraham's polytheistic? No, this is silly. This is what they did. They would take known stories and known deity names, and they would just plop them right on top of Yahweh. Or plop Yahweh right on top of them. And say, whatever your story says, I don't care, this is the God. And so, here's the name. And they kind of would just like take these names over. And say, okay, well now, yeah, we call him Yahweh, but he's also El Shaddai. I mean, that's in Ruth. Shaddai has set his hand against me, is what Naomi says. I mean, she just calls God Shaddai. She doesn't even call it El Shaddai or the Lord or God or anything. He's just Shaddai. And you're supposed to understand it's the same being. It's not some... And so what they're doing is they're kind of redeeming these deity names. And they're saying, well, whatever you want to say, our God is the name above all names. And so we're just going to slap that right on, and you can call it, and that's fine. You can call it Shaddai. You can call it this, but it's the same God. Okay, and so this kind of play happens all throughout the Old Testament, and we're going to get into that more here in just a second. I want to read this from Robert Alter, and then we'll go read this second story. So he talks about Hagar here. This is from his new translation of the Hebrew Bible that's got a commentary with it. He's this old guy who did the entire Hebrew Bible by hand on paper. Like translated it by hand and wrote all his commentary notes by hand. Like that's some commitment. So he says, the narrator had reported only Hagar's weeping. Now we learn, this was originally, now we learn that the boy has been weeping and crying out, and it is his anguish that elicits God's saving response. In the earlier version of the banishment of Hagar in chapter 16, the naming of her future son Ishmael stands at the center of the story. Here, as though the writer were ironically conspiring with Sarah's refusal to name the boy, Ishmael's name is suppressed to the very end, but the ghost of its etymology, God will hear, hovers at the center of the story. So he's just making a point here that this whole build-up to who Ishmael is has been kind of just hovering at the center. And like we said last time, the author is making a point that God works with those who are outside of his covenant people. Okay? Because he still goes out and visits Ishmael. He doesn't leave him alone. He doesn't let him die. And just like with Sodom and Gomorrah, when the cry rises up to heaven, the cry of the boy rises up, which is who knows where that is, to God, and God personally, right? Except for what do we read? Let's go back. Well, let's just do this. I know I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but let's start back in 21:1, and we're going to go through and just point out like 2 or 3 things real quick till I get down to that part of the story. Verse 6, Sarah says, God brought laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. This is one of those interesting prepositions because with can also mean at. And so there's a good little play going on here by the author, which is intentional, that you could take this as Sarah believing that people are going to laugh at her for having a baby in her old age and suckling an infant at 100. Okay, and so what's happening? The Bible's not defending its patriarchs, right? It's putting Sarah in an awkward situation, and it's not trying to protect her. And it's not saying, oh, she did nothing wrong and everything was good for her from then on out. No, she kind of is afraid that people are going to laugh at her. Okay, so we are down in... Let's go to verse 11. Well, actually, I'm sorry. There we go, before that, verse 9. It says, Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. And Sarna noted here, and I think Alter actually confirms it too, that this verse could be kind of construed as Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing her son Isaac, meaning like trying to be Isaac, trying to be like laughing and trying to be the one who was going to get the inheritance. Okay, and so sometimes the English kind of mucks things up a little bit, and the text isn't actually saying that he was playing with Isaac and she got upset about that. What mother would be upset about that? No, he was kind of playing him, like being him. And remember, Ishmael's older at this, he's probably 12, 13 at this time. He's not like a little kid. Okay, and so he's at an age where it's actually time for him to start getting some of this inheritance. And now Sarah's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Some of that, none of that is yours. All of that is my kids. You know, and So Sarah makes him cast her out, and it says the matter in verse 11, the matter is very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. Again, there's ambiguity here on purpose. It doesn't say on account of Isaac or on account of Ishmael. And again, the next verse, even though God says to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman, that does kind of connect the boy and the woman, but it actually still doesn't make it clear. It's just he's distressed. He could be distressed about both of them. You know, there's nothing here that says that Abraham can't be upset about the fact that Ishmael isn't getting what he feels Ishmael deserves. And I mean, I think this stuff is important because this is also what helps us not be Islamophobic, right? Because a lot of times we take this back to like, oh, well, look, I mean, it's in the Bible. Like, well, there's multiple records that all say different things. So let's not make that claim, first of all. And secondly, let's look at how the text actually handles the people in question. Okay, they're being blessed. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make for him a nation. I will make a nation of him also. And some commentators will note that it says, I'll make him a nation, but it doesn't say, and will give him a land. And I think that's kind of setting up for modernism fights more than anything. So Abraham rises up and he does this stuff, and he puts here's one that's just kind of funny with its ambiguity. Took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, who's like 13. So he's like sitting on her shoulders as she's walking out into the wilderness? Or is this kind of just a weird translation? Probably just a weird translation, right? But how many of you have ever thought that and stopped and thought along with the child and thought, well, that's a lot for one woman to carry out into the wilderness, who's probably an older slave woman? Man, Abraham's a jerk. No. And he sent her away, and she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. And one of the things I love about the Hebrew language is that the word beer means well. And in the desert, a well is, it's life. And in 2019, beer is, no, I'm just kidding. No, I'm kidding. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. This presumes quite a bit, right? This presumes that he is weak. So they've been out there for a while. You can't cast a 14-year-old kid who's in good health under the bushes. Like, what's going on? So obviously she's probably gotten lost. One of Abraham's descendants gets lost in the wilderness? Then she went and sat down opposite, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. Oh, what's the author done there? We got some foreshadowing, right? Because it says later on that Ishmael is skilled with a bow. Yeah. So it's like this little play that the author is letting us know he's going to be fine. Like, you can keep reading. He's not going to actually die. For she said, don't let me look on the death of the child. And then here's what I wanted to get to is verse 17. And God heard the voice of the boy, not Hagar, It's Hagar crying, right? God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? So God hears the voice, and an angel talks to Hagar. Okay. And said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. So far, so good. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him. What? Wasn't that something God was doing? Do angels have the ability to make great nations of people in the Bible? No, they don't. I'll answer that for you. Then God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. So who's doing all this? Right. Who's the actor in the, like, what's going, well, some of this is just religion, honestly. God can't be physically doing something because God's not physical. So he has to have a messenger. Okay. And the angel of the Lord, the word is malach. Okay. It's not always angel. Sometimes it's messenger. Sometimes it's like regent, like proclaimer, you know, and the Malach Adonai is the angel of the Lord. And a lot of times that particular construct being gets called God. Like the angel of the Lord will come visit somebody and then it leaves in a fire and smoke and they say, we just saw God, but the text just said it was an angel. So there's this like line that gets kind of crossed over with this character. Okay, and this is something if you wanted to and you had the time and you wanted to go through your Bible and pick a highlighter color you haven't used yet and highlight all the places where it says the angel of the Lord or the messenger of the Lord, and then watch what happens with that phrase kind of throughout the biblical timeline, and just understand that there is something going on there where God is understood to be physical at times. So physicality, the humanness of God, is not foreign to them. Right? I've heard people say, oh, well, you know, Christianity is such a disconnect from Judaism because incarnation is never even something that, and it's like, no, it's actually all over the Hebrew Bible. It's just, it's not incarnation through the womb of a woman. It's God enfleshing himself at times, whether we like that or not. And then it goes on, God was with the boy and he grew up, he lived in the wilderness, and he became an expert with the bow. Which means if you live in the wilderness and you're really good with a bow, you're going to survive. Okay? You're going to be a good hunter, you're going to be able to provide for your mom, you're going to be able to provide for your wife and kids. And so the dude actually ended up being blessed just like God said. Imagine that. Good story, right? This is a cool little like, how did those people get here? God or dad? Like some little Jewish boy asking his parents. That's what this story is. Okay? How did those people get here? Because they're still here. Okay, this isn't like the Moabites who have gone off, right? Or the northern 10 tribes of Israel who are gone. Okay, this is a people group that's actually still around today. And so obviously, somewhere along the line, you've got to explain where that came from because they don't look like us and they don't act like us, but they kind of talk like us. Like the languages are really close, you know, so how do we, we have a folk etymology. Does that mean the story is false? No. You know, and I said this last week, and I'm going to keep repeating it until people, like, you're probably already sick of it, but at no point in any of the biblical writing is there one singular agenda with what they're writing. Okay? And so that means that they're not just trying to write history and history alone, and they're only going to write history. That means that when they write history, they're going to need to reach back to what they know, which includes mythology and includes various forms of philosophy that we don't really practice today. And they include social order that we don't have. You know, so when we go and we like look at what they're saying and it's like, oh, this is bad. Well, you're standing at a weird place in history to be able to say that. Yeah. That's good. You know, it's not like when I look at America 50 years ago and I say that was bad, I have the right to say that. You know, like about certain things. I'm not saying like America was bad. I'm just saying like as an American, I can look back in American history 50 years or so and say, we probably shouldn't have done that. But as an American who has the most amount of law ever known in the history of the world, I don't have the right to look at Israel and say, man, they were legalistic. Or to use that as a means of exclusion in my church. Right. I mean, the amount of private messages and emails and comments on my Facebook stuff that I get that are things like, brother, you're just bound up in the law because all you study is the Old Testament. And it's like, you live in California. Don't ever talk to me about being bound up in the law again. You know, and I don't, I just don't get it. We can number Israel's laws, we can go through and count them. You couldn't count the laws in Fort Collins, let alone America. There you go. You know, so I mean, let's go ahead and knock our high horse down a bit and be like, we're not these gracious people that we think we are. It's just that we don't like laws that tell us what we can and can't do in relationship to God, and that's probably right. Okay. Okay, so then we have another kind of out of nowhere story. So what should we do here? Let's take a poll. Should we continue from Lot directly to Sarah? Or should we go before the Lot saga and get all the Abraham stuff stacked together so that it at least has a logical flow? Well, that's what some scholars have done. And they've said, look, this is obviously a different author, and these are obviously different schools of thought. Some of them call God Yahweh, some of them call God El. And sometimes in the texts that call God El, they will never say the name Yahweh, and sometimes in the texts that say Yahweh, they will never say El. So there's a pretty good theory going on there. Okay, and they call it the documentary hypothesis. You don't need to know any of that because it's like a big debate. But the idea is that more than one school is writing. How many tribes are there in Israel? This shouldn't surprise us. Okay? We don't also need to believe that all 12 tribes came from one individual patriarch. May have happened. We don't need to believe that. Okay? Then we'll get there. The explanation for where the tribes came from is more of we don't know, so let's just write this story. Okay? And more accurately, there probably were just tribes that formed a federation at some point. And they brought all their traditions of their deities together, and some of them won out. Yeah, clans, Well, and they were. I mean, ancient historians will call them Highland clans because they're a lot like the Scottish Highland. They lived on hills alone. I mean, this is when we see Ruth go to Boaz, right? She goes to Bethlehem because that's the only place where there's food, and Bethlehem's a city on a hill. Right? So she has to go down into a valley and go back up. And what's in the valley? Moab. So it's the people who are the tribes are all in this steppe area. And I think that there's a lot of validity to the fact that Hebrew people was more of a slang to talk about those desert dwellers. And it was kind of like a derogatory term, and then the God of the outcast decided to find them. Okay, I like that. Anyways. So we're back here though, and we've got this kind of just strange, we had already heard about Abimelech. Why didn't they just put this with the other Abimelech story? Let's at least keep it contextual, editors. Why? Well, because it's a scroll. It's not a book. They can't just stick a page in. It's a scroll, so they got to attach it onto the end as they keep going. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Okay, so this is why. At that time, Abimelech, again, so he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife from him from the land of Egypt. At that time, which time? I mean, a lot of time has transpired again. Okay, Isaac has been weaned. The kid has almost starved to death in the desert because his mom got lost, and he's gotten really good with a bow and gotten married. That's a lot of time. That's Noah planted a vineyard, harvested the grapes, made some wine, and got drunk. I mean, that's that kind of compression of time. So at what time? At that time, Abimelech comes back on the scene again. And we're just supposed to assume that this is okay. With Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my offspring or with my posterity, but as I have dealt loyally with you, you will deal with me and with the land where you have resided as a ger. I like to say it that way so that you understand what it is. And Abraham said, I swear it. Now, that seems like a self-enclosed story, doesn't it? It's because it is, because look at what the next line says. When Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this to you. Those two aren't connected stories. This is just another thing that Abraham and Abimelech did. It's like scene, and then a new one comes on, and then here's this other scene with Abraham and Abimelech, and then scene, and then they just keep doing this. Watch. Abimelech said, I don't know who's done this. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs of the flock, and Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? He said, these 7 ewe lambs you shall accept from my hand in order that you may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore, okay, so anytime you see this, everybody knows the old seminary dad joke about the word therefore, right? You should always see what it's there for. So that means you got to go back before. So here's the point of this story, is what they're saying. That place was called Beersheba because there both of them swore an oath. What? Beer means well and Sheba means 7. What does that have to do with swearing an oath? Later Hebrew, it actually means swearing. So somewhere along the way, someone decided this well doesn't mean a well of 7, right? Like there's the 7 ewe lambs. They were purchased, the well was purchased for 7, okay? Beer Sheva. That makes sense, right? They came along and said, oh no, it's about the oath. So they throw this in. Because there, both of them swore an oath. That's not what it means. Okay, so just so we know, that's an editorial note that's actually wrong. Yeah. Okay. But the Bible's inerrant. Well, I think the author didn't write that to make it up. I think they thought that. Okay, I don't think they thought that was a falsehood. It's just that it doesn't work with the language. When they had made a covenant at Beersheba, Abimelech with Phicol, the commander of his army, left and returned to the land of the Philistines. I'm going to read you something really funny about that in just a second. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Now, here is the phrase that we want to talk about. Let's read. Abraham resided as an alien many days in the land of the Philistines. Okay, so Abraham's a sojourner. Again, he's a ger in the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree, this is verse 33, in Beersheba and called there on the name of Yahweh. El Olam is what that should say. So he called God the name of another known deity. And that's where I wanted to read this quote that I almost read too earlier. El was the name of the god who was head of the Canaanite pantheon. The Ugaritic texts stress his antiquity and eternity. And the title El du Olam, the Eternal One, has turned up in a 15th century BCE inscription from the hand of a Canaanite miner in Serabit el-Khadem in the Sinai Peninsula. That's not important where it was, but just a 15th century BCE Canaanite inscription. Very, 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 very old. About 1,000 years older than any biblical text we have. How many of you know that like the oldest biblical text we have is about 700 years before Jesus? We don't have anything before that. Okay. However, and this is an important point, Hebrew does not allow the use of a proper name in the construct state joined to a noun. There's a nerd phrase. Basically what he's saying is Hebrew doesn't allow you to join a noun with another noun, because the everlasting one is another noun, and make it a proper name. So it can't be Caleb the Fat. That's not a proper name. Well, I mean, let's just put it in terms we can understand. Okay, so it's not, Abraham isn't worshiping a Canaanite deity. He's ascribing to Yahweh all that belonged to that Canaanite deity. Okay? And I think that that's a very important point that happens in I think this is the first time it happens. Hence, El in the phrase El Olam can no longer be the proper name of a god, but simply means God. The phrase has become an attribute or an epithet of Yahweh, the everlasting God. So this is where we have, you are the everlasting God, right? We used to sing that song, and here's where it comes from. It comes from Abraham planting a tree by some beer. No. But it says they're called on the name of Yahweh, the everlasting God. So which one is it? Is his name Yahweh or is his name El Olam? Well, Hebrew grammar says it has to be Yahweh, the El Olam. So, okay. I don't think that Abraham knew Hebrew grammar, though. Okay, and this is where we're going to close up because I think this is interesting. And I want to say this before I wrap up. I'm more than likely going to make missteps while I'm up here because there are literally 10,000 books and 100,000 articles on about every verse in the Bible. And you will never, ever, 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 ever get to the end of it all. And Daniel, who came to talk to us and gave us the good stuff about the flood when he came, he's got his PhD in biblical languages from Stellenbosch, and his PhD thesis is on Hebrew prepositions. So this is how needled down things get. There are papers written on a singular word. And so part of the misstep comes in you just can't absorb everything. And you got to be comfortable with that. And so I'm totally fine if somebody knows something else that I'm not saying. Even if you're on Facebook and you want to pop into the comments and say, oh, hey, here's something interesting from someone else. But I can only bring so much every week. My e-library has 43,000 books in it. Some of them are essays. And I haven't even scratched the surface yet. And it's just this is a never-ending. For about 4,000 years, people have been debating what the biblical texts mean. And when you go into biblical scholarship, you're expected to work through all of it. And so we've got to go back to ancient interpreters and then work our way up to the early church and then to the church fathers and then to the medieval ages. And there's just a lot of biblical interpretation that's been done. And so when you stack up against all that, someone like me who doesn't have the time left in their life to possibly engage in all of that says, you know what, it's all fan fiction. Let's just go see what the story actually says and make our own interpretive moves with it. Because really this is what's happened, is for about 4,000 years, people have been making their own interpretive moves with the Bible in community. The ones who have always been the most heretical are the ones who have done it on their own. I don't need anybody else. I graduated from church. Some churches you probably should graduate from, but we are in a continual state of need of growth. I know people that have studied Hebrew for 25 and 30 years who, when I say, what's this word mean? They go, I don't know. We all need to grow. We all need to continue to grow. I know absolutely nothing about cutting hair, and my wife knows a lot about it. I don't want to know about that. And she doesn't really want to know about all this, except for what we talk about privately. Okay, so this is kind of the little wrap-up point, and I thought this was interesting. This is also from Robert Alter. And what I'm trying to do is arm you with tools. Okay? I'm not trying to tell you, here's what the Bible means. I have some opinions on what some things mean when the text says certain things. What I'm more trying to do is hand you a toolbox so that when you see a screw, you don't get out a hammer. Or when you see a plank sticking out, you can actually reach for a saw and you don't have to think, oh, well, all I have is this screwdriver and so I'm just going to hack at it until it breaks off. Or if you hit a screw hard enough with a hammer, it might go in. You're not going to get it back out, though. And this is what we've done. And my dad excluded from this statement, but like the fault of biblical illiteracy in the church today lies on the pastors. Because what they've done is they've come in week after week after week after week after week after week as the Bible answer man. And they've said, here's what this means. And everybody swallows it hook, line, and sinker and says, thank you. And then they go home and go about their day. And when that shit doesn't work out, they don't know what to do. Trust me. You want to know why I study the Bible so intently? Because people lied to me over and over and over and said this, that, or the other thing will happen, and it didn't happen. And so I thought, you know what? I am going to go ahead and assume that the people were wrong and go see what it actually says. And I found out in 99% of the instances that like charismatic pastors promise you crap from the pulpit, it ain't in there. Like anywhere. In fact, that mindset is actually hit against continually. You will never have any problems if you come to Jesus. Please don't come to Jesus because you're going to be severely disappointed. Oh, if you're depressed, just put on a happy face. The joy of the Lord is my strength, it says. Look who said that and where he said it. Yeah. He was kind of being chased. But we've got all these promises, and like nobody ever says, open up your Bible, I'm going to give you a promise of God, and then they go read, in this world you will have tribulation. Yep. Here's a promise of God, like directly from the mouth of God. This isn't even like some prophet, oh, I heard God say, this is actually God himself talking. And he says, hey, in this world you're going to have tribulation. Be of good cheer because I've overcome the world, yes, but that doesn't mean you're not going to have it. And tribulation isn't just spiritual attack. Oh. That's modern Americanized Christianity because we don't have actual attack. Yeah. Okay, like we're so comfortable here that we have to spiritualize everything. Tribulation actually means, hey, someone's coming to behead your kid. Be of good cheer. We don't make those promises from the pulpit, right? What we do is we go through and we skim and we find the things that we like. And then we say, okay, here's my theology. It's all the stuff I like. And then all the stuff I don't like, what I have to do is I have to go back and say, well, that wasn't really what it meant, or this isn't really Paul, or this isn't really what it, and it's like exhausting. And we're only up to Genesis 21, and I feel like we're making some good ground in learning, at least in Genesis, what it actually says. And it's going to be cool because we're going to hit points like in Exodus where God himself is talking. Okay, and he's standing over all of Israel. He's standing over the assembly and he says, I am the Lord your healer. It's not some guy. It's not some like far off promise. It's not, and he doesn't say miraculously every time immediately. He just says, if you're going to be healed, it's going to be me. Okay, I don't think that that's a promise that we need to negate. But I also think that sometimes we need to go ahead and say, hey, since the Holy Spirit is in all creation, and there are people who fervently, diligently, honestly seek God for like answers, and someone says, I have this compound that if we press it together and stamp it with a little T and have people take 250 milligrams, their headache will go away. And we're like, God, take my headache. And God's like, go buy some Tylenol. Because the guy who invented that was one of my kids, and he's not an idiot. Right? But we over-spiritualize it because we're not really under attack. And so something that like, Jesus didn't meet the hungry crowd with a metaphysical, if you eat of my flesh, you will never hunger again. See you later. No. He sat down, he's like, guys, go take the fish from that kid. And then, like, we all like to say Jesus multiplied the fish, but actually it doesn't say that. No, it says the disciples did it. They broke and gave. Jesus just blessed it. Okay? So, I mean, it's food. Whether or not he miraculously, I mean, like, it's food. It's not a spiritual thing. Here, have some fish. I'm vegan. Then go home. I'm sure you have some nice hummus at home you can eat. Yes, you can have pita and hummus if you're on vegan diet. Go. I am the bread of life. No, Jesus. I can't have carbs. You've all seen the cartoon, right? Like, I can picture it. Okay. Anyway, so all of this is to say that, like, we're not doing this because we're trying to take up time. We're doing this because I can venture a guess, and this is not a knock on anybody, that most of us have more opinions about the text than we do time reading it.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Like, I was laughing with Gabby on the way over here this morning because it's like, I know I'm not old, but I'm also not young anymore. And so now I'm at this fun age where I'm 40, and I get to watch these 20-year-olds doing the stuff that I used to do when I was 20. And now I laugh at it, and I realize why people used to laugh at me. And they'll say something like, in all my studies. And I'm like, ha, 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 ha. You're 20. You know, in all my studies, you can't have yet. There's not enough time for you to have done that yet. You know? Yeah, right? It's like we don't realize how much is out there that we haven't even scratched the surface of. And again, a lot of it's because we have pastors that won't tell us that it exists. You know, if you're interested in any of this at all, I wrote a blog on the church website called A Plea for Biblical Literacy in the Church. And I listed on there like dozens of resources that are all free or very cheap, or like commentaries that you can buy that are all like respectable and trustworthy and scholarly. And there's a lot of them. And people, I think that we are to a point where people are done with the whole like infallible pastor giving them baby food every Sunday. Like, here, let me feed you. You know, this isn't what it's supposed to be about. Pastor doesn't mean baby feeder. It means gatherer, really. It's like it's the loud guy that can get everybody together. It doesn't even mean teacher. That's a separate thing. Okay. So this is to finally close this out. And I'll just say, you know, stay with us, because we'll get, as we go, I'm going to start bringing back in some of this stuff that happens. Like right now, we're reading the setup. But the rest of the Bible deals with the setup. And so if you know the setup, then you can, when these other guys start talking about it, you can say, whoa, 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 whoa. Like we did with Jubilees, right? Jubilees says that Lot was one of the most heinous sinners, and the Bible actually doesn't say that. It says that he didn't even know. So if you know the setup, then when other people quote the setup, like Jesus, as it was in the days of Noah, does that mean Jesus thought there was a literal flood? Probably did. You know, does that mean he thought Noah was a literal being? Who knows? But what it does mean is that Jesus understood that what the Bible was saying about Noah was that it was very, very violent then. You know, and for the select one or three out there who think that homosexuality had anything to do with the flood, please just actually read your Bible. Like 10 minutes in Genesis 7 to 11 and you should be fine. Okay, this is Alter. He's talking about the land of the Philistines, and none of us would have known anything about that unless we'd taken an ancient Near Eastern geography course and knew that there's no possible way that the Philistines could be here at this time. This is an often noted anachronism, the incursion of the Philistines from Crete to the coastal area of Canaan, post-dating the patriarchal period by more than 400 years. So the Philistines don't even come on the scene until 400 years after this patriarchal era is thought to have ended. So it's not even like, there's not even close. Like, it's not like 30 years later or anything like that. It's like these people are just not there. The writer may mean merely to refer casually to this region in geographical terms familiar to his audience. That makes sense. But what that means is that his audience is around when the Philistines are there, which is at least 400 years after. And this isn't 400 years after Abraham, because remember, there's still Isaac, and then there's Jacob, and then there's the tribes. Okay? And so this is probably 600 years or so out that the Philistines are not even there yet. It is not clear that Abimelech, with his Semitic name, and we talked about Abimelech means my father is king. So at some point, this guy probably was a prince. He was Prince Abimelech. Prince Abubu. Those of you who have seen the cartoon Aladdin got it. So he has a Semitic name, Abimelech, my father is king, is meant to be thought as a Philistine king. So he's just saying here that there's no way that someone with a Semitic name would have been a Philistine king. Okay, that's just not how it works, because they didn't come from the same area and they didn't speak the same language. Even though Goliath totally understands David and they speak English to each other, they actually didn't speak the same language. You know? So what we have here then is further proof positive that what we're dealing with is a collection of texts that have a lot of antiquity to them, that also have a much, much, much later editorial hand. And so when we get into discussions of things like inspiration, who's inspired? Is it the author? Is it the editor? Which editor? How do you know which one stopped? How do you know when it stopped? Some of these texts weren't solidified until 1,000 years later. Some of them, there are interpretive traditions that surround. There are several different versions of Isaiah. It's widely regarded that the Septuagint version of Jeremiah is more reliable than the Hebrew version. You know, there are things that, the Septuagint text, that's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It doesn't match our Hebrew Bible, which means it has a different Hebrew master that it uses. And multiple manuscripts that make up what they call the Septuagint. There's no book called the Septuagint. Okay? And these are ancient Jews who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, who it was requested of them that a Greek translation be made of their book. So they started making Greek translations, but they all differ. The different schools translate things differently. Sometimes they make mistakes. There's one that I'm almost 100% sure is a mistake that Paul forms a doctrine out of. What do you do with that? What do we fall back on? Do we say, Paul's right? Well, why? Okay, the Septuagint's right. Why? Well, the Hebrew Bible's right. Okay, why? Which one are we going to go with? Because the Hebrew Bible says one thing, and then the Septuagint translates it incorrectly, and then Paul forms a doctrine out of that incorrect translation. So do we then... No, study to show yourself approved. Sometimes things are confusing and are not going to be worked over by a third grader in 5 minutes on Sunday morning. There are things that I'm working through right now that I've got 20, 30, 40 hours of study in on one verse, and that I don't know what to do with it yet. Thank God they're in later books and we're going to get there later. Maybe by that time I'll know. But when Paul formulates and he says, be careful lest a root of bitterness spring up among you. The Greek word for bitter in the Septuagint, the psalm that he's quoting when he says this is a mistranslation. And it's not talking about that. You know, in the Hebrew Bible, bitterness gets rewarded. God rewards Naomi for her bitterness. You know, in her bitterness. Not for it, but in it. You know, God's not turned off by bitterness like Paul seems to think. And yet somehow, today in the church, what do we have? We've got this exclusion of people who are bitter, and we say, you're just bitter. And it's yeah, that's a scar. Yes. You know, and when you say, you're just bitter, you've just totally minimized that pain. Yes. And you said it's not important. And why? Because Paul says, Paul was wrong. Amen? Amen. You're dismissed.